Hello, everyone. My name is Gershon Margolis. I am the founder of Imperial Advisories. We are a fractional CFO firm. And what we do is we go into businesses and we work with CEOs and CFOs, helping them make better business decisions. We have an amazing team of CFOs and other financial professionals. Our CFOs have an average of over 30 years of experience, and many of them have been in other roles as well, which gives us a broad perspective as we work with businesses. So we are CFOs, but we also understand other parts of the business, and we hopefully recognize problems, even problems that are beyond what we do and beyond our area of expertise, and then we endeavor to bring in the right professionals. And as many of you know, we live in a litigious society. There's lots of legal stuff going on, lots of things you have to be careful about. I'm sure we're going to learn a lot about a lot of interesting things today. And but anyway, today I'm very excited to have Ryan and Jennifer. They are employment attorneys, and they're here to educate us all on some of the things out there today, some of what's going on in the market. There have been recent laws about listing pay, what you need to say, how you need to say it. There was an ad I saw that got posted and reposted on social media a couple of months ago of some company that had a range of like $50 to $1 million as the salary. I'm sure we'll learn about how, if that works, how that works. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan and Jennifer. Actually, with further ado, one second. I'm going to spend one moment and mention the people from our team who are here. So for starters, thank you, Brittany, for putting this together. We appreciate your help with this and with everything. Jim, it's great to have you. Thank you for joining. Barry, good to have you. There's one person who I can't see. I'm guessing that's my partner, Ken. And if it is, great to have you. If it's not, whoever else it is, great to have you too. Thank you to all of our guests as well. And now, without further ado, Ryan and Jennifer.
Thank you, Gershon. And sign me up for that $50 million job. Let me know where that is.
It was like Google or something.
I'll Google right after this webinar. But good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending. Also, thank you to Gershon, Brittany, the rest of the Imperial Advisory team for hosting this webinar. My colleague, Jennifer Carter, and I are going to be diving into the world of pay transparency and pay equity, two related terms that have been really hot items for lawmakers over the past couple of years. And if you just stop and think about how transparent our society is today, it's really not a surprise. Okay, if you have social media, you have knowledge of what every meal everyone has each day, how much steps they're taking. There's things like Google Earth, where I'm pretty sure our neighbors can see what we're watching on Netflix. You have Zillow, where you could look up what your neighbor bought for their house. And you even have folks on the internet being transparent about selling contact lenses from Taylor Swift concerts. Okay, so it's a transparent world that we live in, period. It's going to get more transparent each day. And now it's not a shock that transparency is seeping into the workplace now with pay transparency laws, where candidates really want to know what they can earn, both minimum and maximum, in order for them to make choices on whether or not they're going to be able to get paid, compensated fairly, not based on any protected characteristic like age, race, gender, or other characteristics. So the two main concepts we're going to talk about are pay transparency and pay equity. Pay transparency is really just about a business's openness, both internally for existing employees, as well as externally to the outside world in their pay practices. Now, pay equity is really the second step. That's the ultimate goal of pay transparency. That is when you have employees at your job who are getting paid equally for equal work, regardless of gender, age, or any other protected characteristic. So I'm going to talk about pay transparency. My colleague Jennifer is going to talk about pay equity. We'll have time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions while we're presenting, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and Jennifer and I will be as transparent as possible in answering those questions for you. So for pay transparency, let's just start off with the so what. So why should your business care about pay transparency? Well, there's really three reasons. The first is, obviously, if you're doing business and a pay transparency law applies, you want to comply. You don't want to be hit with fines or worse, a lawsuit. And this is the thing, even if your business currently doesn't have a pay transparency law that applies, it's coming to a theater near you very soon. So if you just go back to 2019 alone, we now have 8 states, including New York State, that have implemented pay transparency laws. We also have 7 major cities, including New York City, that have pay transparency laws. And we also have 8 states, as well as the federal government, with bills pending. So this is really a hot item for lawmakers. And while the laws are going to differ based on where your business is and what laws apply, the crux of these laws is that if you're going to post a position publicly for applicants on sites like Indeed, LinkedIn, Monster, even job fairs, you have to, in good faith, post the minimum and the maximum pay ranges for those positions. And then internally for your existing employees, whenever you have promotional opportunities or lateral transfer opportunities, you have to do the same. You have to post internally. So again, these laws do differ based on where you are. Some laws have even stricter requirements. They will also require that you post a job description. And some laws also require that you post benefits that are tied to a position. But the bottom line is you want to be aware of what laws apply to your business and you want to comply. So the second reason is pay equity. I mentioned that that's really the holy grail. That's what you want to achieve. And this is what lawmakers are thinking of when they're making these pay transparency laws around the country, because currently, unfortunately, there still exists a pay gap across the United States. Women still earn on median average less than a male, and that pay gap increases if you're a female and you're a minority. So these laws are really attempting to narrow that gap. And the idea that lawmakers have is if pay is more transparent, it's going to give candidates and existing employees more ammunition to negotiate and ensure that they're compensated fairly. The third thing is it's good for business. So we saw recently with DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that businesses incorporated around the country, that it was a win-win. So employees feel more engaged, more inclusive with those initiatives, and that leads to better output. So it's a similar idea for pay transparency. The more information employees and applicants have about pay, the more you're going to be able to retain them, the more you're going to be able to attract top talent, and it's good for business. So I mentioned the pay gap that's out there that's really propelling these pay transparency laws around the country. On this slide on the left, this is a 2023 study by PayScale about what female employees earned relative to men. And in 2023, a female still earns about 83 cents for every dollar a male earns. Now on the right, they also did a controlled study. That's a study that tries to account for as much as possible things like job title, skills, and experience. And in that study, the pay was a lot closer. It was 99 cents a woman earns for every dollar a male earns. However, if you compound this over time, it's still significant over lifetime earnings. So close is not equal. And another interesting thing about this study is I look back to 2002, 20 years ago when they did this. And at that time, a woman earned about 80 cents for every dollar a male earned. So we haven't really seen a lot of progress in 20 years, only 3 cents. It's also interesting if you look at the different pay in comparison to the locations around the country. So in New York, in 2023, a woman earned about 89 cents for every dollar a male earned. If you go to Wyoming, it's 68 cents.
Question. Now, if women in New York earn 89 cents, what did the controlled pay gap? Did they actually make more money than men once you control for differences? Like, do you see it bumped up 6 points on both colors for New York, for example?
That's interesting. I have to look exactly at the controlled New York study. So the study only revealed the uncontrolled results per state. But I would imagine that if you did control it, it would be higher than 89 cents. I don't know if it would be exactly a dollar per dollar what a male makes, but that's a great question to verify that data.
And if it turned out that it was more, would that then mean that, it just depends on location, and some places women make more and some places men make more?
It could, and that's a great point that you make, but it also varies based on race too. So we'll see that the study here is really looking at a white female. And then the next slide, this is a good segue, Jennifer, is that they did this study. This is by Pew Research with respect to the pay gap over 40 years when you're a female and a minority compared to a white male. So if you look at a Black female in 2022, they earned about 70 cents for every dollar a male earned. A Hispanic female was 65 cents for every dollar a male earned. And that really hasn't picked up a lot over the course of 40 years if you look at that graph. However, Asian females are making progress. It looks like 93 cents for every dollar a male earns. So, the bottom line is the proof is in the pudding nationally with respect to this data. And this is really what's propelling these pay transparency laws for lawmakers.
Ryan, I have two questions. This is Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Hi. What is the margin of error on these studies? Because when you're talking 99 cents versus $1, that's a 1% different, but what's the margin of error that the data could be slightly skewed? And my second question is, when you're talking about the comparison of what a woman in any of the categories you just had in the last slide is compared to a man, is that just a white man, or is it a man in the category that they are actually in?
Great questions. I'll answer the second one first. So it is a white man in that study.
Okay.
And the links for these two studies have great information. They're posted on both of the slides. We could also post them in the chat if you want to look at the details more thoroughly after this. So I don't know the exact answer as to the margin of error. I do know that this was a study that they looked into after COVID, when there was a wealth of different information available through surveys, through unemployment, because unemployment skyrocketed. And that's where they were able to cull all this information. But to answer your question, I don't know the margin of error, but I'm sure with these links, digging in these studies, I'll be able to get that for you.
Well, based on what you just, somebody else, go ahead, Isaac.
No, Jim, go ahead, please finish up. I'm sorry.
I had one other question, based on what you just said. Well, I can't remember what I was going to ask you, so go ahead, Isaac. I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to you once Isaac asks his question.
Okay, I apologize for distracting you. I was going to ask Ryan. So this pay transparency, it seems to be doing really effective and positive change in closing the gap. I was wondering if any of these laws or any states also have like an affirmative action component to it, where you might start seeing that females or different races are starting to get paid more because of certain laws that are coming into effect.
That's a great question. So none of the laws I've seen yet have any type of affirmative action component in them, but they're certainly going to be tracking the progress of these laws. They're all relatively new, so I don't think the data is out there yet to see how this is actually going to narrow the gap. It would definitely be interesting to monitor that and see what kind of impact it's having. But there are no affirmative action components to this, just transparency.
That being said, it seems like a really good progress and like a good solution, like in the middle, where you're not taking out the market from deciding the wages, but just by being transparent, you're actually allowing others to compete on the same ground that an insider or someone that has more knowledge on the field would have. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. This definitely changes the negotiation game for applicants tremendously. And it's not just because they're going to be armed with having more information about the pay ranges, but a few years back, before these transparency laws came about, there was what was known as the salary history ban, meaning that a business, for example, in New York, could not ask an applicant what they made, or what they're currently making, or what they made at previous jobs until they gave a job offer, right? So the scales have really tipped in favor of the applicant at the negotiating table.
Yeah, and I remember the questions I was gonna ask. So I think that it's because of the way the data is laid out, that we're comparing people of different race and ethnicity to white men specifically. So now you can understand the relationship between the numbers. What I'm wondering is, I'm wondering the different type jobs, if the gap is, obviously for some jobs, it's going to be wider, and some of the jobs, the gap is going to be thinner. Or maybe there were even some types of roles where women were actually making equal or more than a white guy. But at the end of the day, because that might help a person look into an industry where they actually want to work as opposed. So for example, I'm sure this includes hourly labor type work, working in the doorway of Walmart or being a cashier or something like that. But this also has a lot of salary type jobs in it. And those are the jobs that are more lucrative and people get better benefits and all that kind of stuff. So when I worked at companies like Coach and Timberland before I became a consultant, and I was in New York, well, one was in New York, the other was in New Hampshire. I don't think there was, back in those days, a difference between what men and women were being paid as a function of somebody being a man or a woman, because there were plenty of women that were making far more than I was, doing more or less the same work. And it was the other way around. I think a lot of what people were getting paid was a function of what you just said, Ryan. When they were coming into these jobs back in those days, people knew how much you were making before they made an offer to you. So in other words, this deck was stacked when you made less to continue to make less than somebody else in the same job. And it didn't matter if you were a guy or a girl. And that's exactly what happened to me in my career. In order for me to get to that next big step, I needed to get a promotion. And even the promotions didn't come with all the dollars that other people were making. Because when I was in accounting, I could see what everybody was making because I was basically paying the payroll. And I'm talking big companies like Timberland and Coach, I could see everybody in an entire division, what they earned. And there were plenty of women as vice presidents in roles like I was in that were making more than I was, because I came into the company making a lot less because I came from a company that was outside the United States. So I think that the way increases are made goes deeper than disparities because of race and ethnicity. I think it has to do with the whole concept of how poverty works in this country and how justice within poverty works. And I don't think it matters what color, whether you're white or anything else, Black, Hispanic, Asian. I don't think that matters as much as, I think poverty plays a bigger role in the numbers than what people are understanding today. That was really what my concept was. I was wondering if you had thought anything about how poverty plays a role into this.
It's an interesting comment. And if you do go on that website, it breaks down all the data by state as well as different industries. I know you hit on that. So relatively speaking, there are differences based on industries, based on companies. And I'm sure poverty also plays into it geographically as well. I mean, I don't think they can put their finger on exactly what is driving the pay gap, but nationally, this is what legislators are looking at. This is the stuff that's driving it. So I want to turn our attention now to the states that currently have passed pay transparency laws on the screen. There's about 8 of them. Of course, California has passed a transparency law, right? Not a surprise. Connecticut, though, which is, by the way, the best pizza state in the country. I'm going to be giving a couple of bonus pizza tips throughout the webinar. You have Sally at Pizzas and Frank Pepe in Connecticut. But Connecticut was actually one of the first states to implement these pay transparency laws. Currently, the law is a little bit different than New York. What it requires is that if an applicant asks for the minimum and maximum pay ranges for a position, the business has to give it to the applicant. If the applicant doesn't ask, the business has to give it to the applicant at least sometime before a job offer is made. That's what the current law says. However, there is a proposed law on the books that will align Connecticut more with other states like New York that require these ranges be in public job advertisements. So that hasn't been law yet, but we're monitoring that. So New York State, actually, that law is in progress. It's going to take effect. It's no longer just a bill. You have some lead time. We're going to get into that in more detail, but right now the effective date is September 17th, 2023. So New York in general is really a hotbed for these pay transparency laws. If you look on the screen, in addition to the state, you have New York City that has its law on the books since November 1st, 2022. You also have Ithaca, Westchester County, and Albany County. And if you're a New York business, you may fall within a couple of these jurisdictions. So you may ask yourself, which one do I have to apply? Well, all of them, if you fall within the jurisdictions. It's just probably easier to apply the one that is most strictest in terms of giving employee rights. Just a quick note about Jersey City. Again, I'm transparent about my pizza. Best pizza place in the country is in Jersey City. It's called Raza on Grove Street. But there's a lot of businesses that are now moving to Jersey City. They have their pay transparency law in effect. It requires businesses with 5 or more employees, including independent contractors, to post the minimum and maximum pay ranges in their job postings, as well as the benefits that are tied to each position. So healthcare benefits, 401k, overtime, stocks, bonds, things like that.
How do you determine what is an independent contractor for something like that? You know, our business, for example, we have many independent contractors. Many businesses have attorneys, right? Those are independent contractors, and the marketing agency you work for, that could be that you work. So I suspect that that's not what they're going after. They're going after employees who are misclassified in that number. But I don't. One, is that true? And two, like, how do you draw the line between?
Yeah, I mean,
hiring?
the independent contractor classification issue is probably owes its own 1 or 2 webinar sessions, because it's very difficult. There's no black and white answer to whether or not someone is an independent contractor. We'll talk about in a minute how New York City does count independent contractors as employees for purposes of these pay transparency laws and knowing whether or not they apply. But at the end of the business, I mean, at the end of the day, the test in New Jersey, there's the ABC test, and it really depends on the amount of control a business has over the worker. The more independence the worker has from the business hiring them from services, the more likely they are an independent contractor. If they could work for others, they're not on the company website, so forth and so on. There's a lot of different factors. But I would say if you're a business, and for example, in Jersey City, and you're close to that count, you may want to err on the side of caution and just count and just start complying with the law.
Right. But my question is, if you have an attorney, right, and you have maybe an employment attorney also, and you also have a marketing agency, those are also, certainly if any of those people have standalone businesses, those are all going to be independent contractors. You could have no employees and have enough independent contractors to have to comply with this law, right? For any business that works with other businesses, all those other businesses wouldn't all those fall into the independent contractor count?
No,
Or
I
only
wouldn't
standalone?
believe. Yeah, I wouldn't believe. I think you're talking about more so contractors you're engaging to, really perform project work for your business on a limited basis. lawyers have never been treated as independent contractors for purposes of really any of these laws. But,
Mhm.
I wouldn't be surprised if years down the road that businesses start doing that. I mean, with laws, lawmakers start doing that, but that's not what the intention was for an independent contractor. It's much more narrow than that.
Okay, thank you.
So there's also a lot of states that are looking to join the party here. Aloha, Hawaii even wants to get in the mix with the pay transparency law. Illinois, this actually has to change because just last week, Illinois approved its law. That's going to take effect January 1st, 2025 for businesses in Illinois with 15 or more employees. New Jersey has a law that's currently pending. It's going to require salary ranges as well as benefits for only businesses with 5 or more employees. And then you have the federal government. So if that law passes, that's going to fill in all the gaps around the country because it's going to apply to all businesses with at least 1 employee. It's only right now as written going to require the posting of the minimum and maximum ranges, nothing else. But what is daunting is that in the bill itself, it endorses a class action against businesses who are violating these laws. So that's when 1 employee can represent all similarly situated employees who are alleged victims of these laws. And that attracts a lot of attorneys and attorneys' fees. So now let's hone in more specifically on the New York State law. So again, this is not in effect yet. It will be in September 2023. It applies to businesses with 4 or more employees. This does not count independent contractors, unlike New York City for that analysis. And what it requires is that businesses have to post externally to job sites like Indeed, LinkedIn, Monster, or advertisements in newspapers, the minimum or maximum compensation range for each position, as well as a job description if one exists. Now, I just want to stop right there and just mention this because a lot of these pay transparency laws, businesses almost view them as compelling them to advertise. Nothing in these laws will force someone to advertise. If you are a business and if you want to go the old school route of just putting the help wanted sign in your business and have folks come in and apply for any open positions, you could do that. You could put a link on your website, inquire for positions within. That's fine. What these laws do is say, if you are publicly advertising for open positions out there, then you have to comply with these pay transparency laws.
Question.
Yep.
So I use WhatsApp, as people on our team know, and WhatsApp has this feature called statuses where people just like post things. And there's also WhatsApp groups, and there's probably lots of other platforms. I'm sure I've seen this on LinkedIn too, where someone will post looking for financial analyst, looking for administrative assistant, 3 years of experience, and that's it. So now those putting out a post like that to your network is a violation. If you've got 4 employees, that becomes a violation of pay transparency? Or is that like a help wanted sign?
So the law says that if you're advertising to a pool of potential applicants, so arguably, if you're putting it out there to a network that includes a pool of potential applicants electronically, then it could be covered. I have not seen any of the states or the city yet go after those type of ads. They're really looking at those Indeed, those LinkedIn, and those other, no-brainer job advertisements, rather than, the one-off instances like you just described. But if you read the law in advertising electronically to a pool of applicants, a specific position, then arguably it could be covered. Okay, and we'll get into New York City. Luckily, what they have is if you are violating, for instance, in that case, they'll send you a notice first to cure within 30 days before you get hit with a fine.
Got it.
But that's a
Nice.
great question. That is an excellent question to be tested, but arguably it could. Okay, so New York State, there is an exception. You don't have to post specific commission when you're talking about commission-only employees. Okay. However, if someone is getting a salary and a commission, then you still have to post the salary. The one silver lining in New York is that there's no private right of action. That's great. That means that if a alleged victim of these pay transparency laws wants to sue you in court, they can't. The only recourse is through the Department of Labor Commission in New York. And at this time, there's only civil penalties of $1,000 for a first violation, $2K for a second, and $3K for a third, and then every violation after that. So that's good. There is an amendment that's going to take effect in September 2023, and that is targeting remote workers. So the law in New York will cover opportunities that can be physically performed, at least in part, in New York, or physically performed outside of New York. But if that person is reporting into a supervisor office or work site in New York, they're going to be covered. So, for example, if you're a New York business and you're hiring for an opportunity where the applicant lives in Ohio, but for the position, if hired, is going to be reporting into a supervisor in New York, then they're going to be covered. You have to comply with the pay transparency law for that position.
Do you have to comply with both states' laws if both have laws?
You would. You would. And we'll get into the SAT question, right? This is taking us back to like SAT with if this employee works here remote, it's really complicated, onerous. And especially when you're nationally, or you're just a business that has employees working everywhere, you just may want to consider the cost benefit and the ease of administration in just complying, posting these minimum and maximum ranges, especially when this is going to be everywhere soon.
Now, if you hire someone and they start off in one place, let's say in the same state, and then they move to a new state, and you complied with your old state's laws, but not with the new state's laws where they moved, does anything happen there, or what if you don't know if they're going to be remote at the time?
Yeah.
When they're hired?
So good question. So the laws make clear that where we're looking is at the time of posting. So that would be the place and time of whether you would have to determine if the business was complying or not complying with the law. So at the time of posting, if they lived in New York, that's the law you're looking at. If they move, then you would have to consider them potentially for a new law when you're determining pay ranges for a subsequent hire in that position, if that makes sense. But you raise a great question, Gershon, because in this remote world that we're living in, employees are moving left and right. They're not telling their employers, right? So for HR folks and businesses out there, you should have a known requirement that if you're moving, let us know, right? Because you're going to have to know what laws you're applying to. So the New York City law up here, it's a little bit broader in coverage. It applies to employers with 4 or more employees, including the owners of the company and independent contractors. But only one of the employees has to work in New York City. So you could be a company in Nebraska with 6 employees, but 1 employee in New York City, you could be covered, okay? Like New York State, you have to disclose the minimum and maximum ranges. And they don't give you a lot of guidance on what's a bad faith or what's a good faith range. What the law says is, for example, you can't post a minimum and maximum range that's the same, or it can't be open-ended. In a couple slides, I'll give you some examples of how you can apply or comply with what we believe is a good faith range example. So New York City also extends to positions that can or will be performed at least in part in New York City, not as broad as New York State, but what that likely covers is remote employees who are residents of New York City, working in New York City, even though the business could be out of state. Business could be in Alaska. But if you have an employee living in New York City and working remotely in New York City, it could apply. So unlike New York State, there is a private right of action only for employees under New York City, not for applicants. So if you are a current employee and you believe you're grieved in some way, you could file a lawsuit in court, get an attorney, get attorney's fees. Otherwise, the other option for both employees and applicants is to file a complaint with the New York City Commission of Human Rights, which has the ability to issue up to $250,000 in fines. But then there is that good faith period of 30 days where you can cure it and avoid fines. New York City has proposed amendments. They're not effective yet. If they are approved, businesses will have 180 days to comply. So you have some lead time, but these are pretty expansive changes. The law will also require the posting of a job description as well as the benefits for a job. And then there's an annual requirement for current employees to give them the pay range for their position upon request, or at least annually. So if that becomes effective, probably it makes most sense when you're in annual review discussion to say, here is the range for your position each year, just so you satisfy that requirement. All right, let's stop and take a quick test. Let's look at 3 actual postings for New York City positions after that law went into effect. Does anyone want to take a crack and see which of these does or does not comply with the pay transparency laws?
My guess is none comply.
It's a good guess. I mean, clearly Citibank. This was an actual posting. Citibank took it down almost immediately, said it was a technical error, but that would probably be the clearest not good faith example. The Dow Jones and New York Post, it's not black and white. You can't tell. There could be different positions that could have a large range because it varies based on experience. I know for an attorney example, a first-year associate and a 10th year, you could have a wide variance in pay. So you would want more information to know whether or not this is in good faith to comply with the laws. This is the thing, that if an agency challenges your business under these laws, it's the agency's job to prove bad faith. It's not your business's job to prove good faith. However, I would recommend that at the time you're making these postings, your business memorialize some business justification for the posting at that time, just so later on you don't have to go back if ever challenged, to support the good faith. You could do that in a few ways. First, the easiest is if you have a pay scale. Not every business has a formal pay scale, but that would be the easiest. If you have a collective bargaining agreement for unionized employees, that would also be easy. You could look at what your current employees are earning in comparable positions. You can look at what you've budgeted for the position. You can benchmark what your competitors are doing. And there's also something I've seen called the 20/20 rule. This isn't anything that's authorized by the law, but as far as I know, it hasn't been challenged. And that is, you come up with a target salary you want to pay for this position, and then you post a range that is 20% below the minimum and then 20% above the maximum to give yourself some wiggle room. At the end of the day, there's going to be deference to businesses, right? These agencies are going in blind with these challenges, but you want to be able to rationalize it. So the last,
The thing that's most striking to me about what you just showed us is, from a business standpoint, I don't think it behooves the business owner to publish or to post information like this. Because if they're looking for a candidate on the lower end of the scale, when you post a job that has a range between 50,000 and 145, let's forget about the Citibank one, because that just looks like that just looks ridiculous. And it's a technical reporter. You're going to get a lot of people, if you really want somebody that's on the higher end, you're going to get a whole lot of people responding that you don't want to even look at their resumes. And then you got all these bots and everything else involved today. So it just causes your business to cost more money to run itself to find good candidates. And then you might even scare away the good candidates because they don't want to deal with what they're going to have to go through when they see a range that is that big, because they don't really think they're going to be appreciated for what they can bring to the business. So companies that I've worked for, we would never, we were, like you said, we would understand, get information off the web or whatever, but understand what is the right range and then do exactly what you just said. And by creating a smaller minimum and maximum difference, you're going to get the people that are qualified applying for that job. So I don't think it makes sense for businesses to behave this way. And especially the New York Post and Dow Jones, it seems like there was a lack of thought going into the effort. And if you really want a good job, why would you apply for a job when they're not even, if they're not going to do the work up front to get the best candidates in the door? How are you going to be treated when you're employed by that company? See, it creates, and this goes back to the whole concept that you brought up earlier about pay disparity, because it just keeps the whole thing going. So I have a point of view about poverty, and I have a point of view about the behavior that you see, especially in companies like this, where they're not really putting their best foot forward to find the best candidates, and they're basically keeping the bad practices going, but they may not be related to anything to do with the concepts we talked about before between race and gender and stuff like that. It's more insidious. It's built into the nature of how they're attracting. And then what about retaining talent? The cost of retaining talent is huge. Or if the failure to spend some money on retaining talent causes people to leave, you have a revolving door. And companies that have a revolving door cannot meet their goals. They can't grow. They really struggle with that. And I'm not talking about mom and pop and small businesses with less than, let's say, 20 employees or even less than 50 employees. I'm talking about all businesses. So I have seen the other side. Like I've worked in big companies like Coach, Timberland, Lockheed Corporation, and all the way back 30, 40 years ago. And at the end of the day, the human resource aspect of the business is very, very important to managing your team of people, which allows your company to be prosperous. So spending some money on what you're trying to attract is super important. I just went through this with a client. We found a great controller for the business, but it was in that level of effort that I was explaining to the client over and over again that they had to put the energy into attracting the right individuals. And we went through not a lot of resumes, but for the size of the business that he was, we went through probably 40 or 50 resumes, and we pared it down to 5 or 10 candidates, and then probably 10 candidates, and we interviewed almost 7 or 8 of them. And it was an exhausting effort, but he got a great person in that job. But it required a level of effort. And I think that's what's really important. And the transparency side, I think what it does is like any other data. When you start to really look at what's going on, you start peeling back that onion, you get the opportunity to see what is really happening. And if you want to dig down far enough and think hard enough about it, you start to find other tangential things that are impacting what's happening in your own business. And I think that's what's great about this type of work, because then it allows people to make informed decisions. But I think there's more here. The New York Post, shame on them. What they represent in something like this is, in my mind, a hypocrisy. Citibank, well, banks are banks. That's all I can say to that. And Dow Jones, they're focused on other things than trying to find a software development engineer with this stuff. That's the way I think about it. And I know I have a very pointed position on this, but at the end of the day, I have seen a lot of wage discrepancies in a lot of companies. I've worked overseas too. And what we pay people in other countries is different than we pay them here. But there has to be justice. There has to be a fair and equitable solution at the end of the day. And I think that transparency is moving us closer to that, which I think is great.
Thanks, Jim. I mean, you raise a good point just about for human resources professionals and recruiters that you really want to look into these ranges and how narrow or broad you want to make them, because that is going to drive into decision making for applicants, right? So
When I worked, one other quick comment and I'll shut up. When I worked at Coach, its human resources organization was broad and they were very smart. And when I first got there, I didn't understand this, but I understood it later. They did not want to pay people below the midpoint because they wanted to create golden handcuffs so people wouldn't leave. So they paid you above the midpoint, but they also didn't want to pay you into the fourth quartile if you divided up a pay scale into 4 pieces, because they knew that you were going to max out and then they wouldn't be able to give you increases anymore. And people that got to the point where they were at the high end of the scale were getting lump sums every year because they weren't going to get an increase in their salaries. Coach was very, very disciplined and dedicated to this approach. And what it really did was it leveled the playing fields, but it also forced people that were not promotable to leave the organization. And frankly, I think Coach wanted that. I wasn't in human resources because they wanted to hire younger people that wanted to drive their careers, but they always paid above the midpoint because they didn't want to lose the person, because the cost we grew 23% compound annual growth rate in 7 years. We went from $500 million to $2.7 billion. The hierarchy in the company, the senior executives, they did not want to deal with constantly having a revolving door and replacing people. So they really worked hard to create real good job descriptions and what the roles and pay ranges were. And it worked for us. I'm not saying it always works, but it worked for us there. And it worked for us at Timberland too. Which are bigger companies. If you're a small business, starting out with this mindset is not a difficult thing to do at all. It's not hard. It just requires a person to think differently about the value of the human capital, which is the most important asset, I think, in any organization.
thanks, Jim. I just want to get going now because I still want Jennifer to hit on just important points on pay equity in the limited time we have. Over here on the screen, this is 3 things that you should be doing quickly to comply with these laws. Number 1, do your homework. Know which states, which jurisdictions apply to your business. And one thing is you want to check your salary thresholds for exempt employees. Those thresholds go up each year in New York and New York City. On the screen, I have exactly what those amounts are. Make sure you double check those before posting. Update your job descriptions. Make sure that the positions are still accurate after COVID, especially if you have to post those. And then again, if you're a national company, it may just make more sense for administration to comply, okay, and start posting these ranges everywhere. All right, Jen, I know we have a little bit of time left and there was a lot to cover on equal pay, but it's certainly an important piece of the pie. Is there anything that you want to share with us in the limited time that we have?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So I'm going to try to go through this a little quickly, so bear with me because we are a little short on time. But so pay equity, that is essentially what it sounds like. The idea that, you're paid, that there's equal pay for equal work. So comparable employees and comparable jobs should not be paid differently regardless of, race, gender, or other protected category. If they are paid differently, there has to be a legitimate business reason for that discrepancy. So the focusing on pay equity is important for a few reasons, similar to the pay transparency focus. So again, equity increases recruiting, retention, productivity. When employees tend to want to work at companies that ensure that men and women are paid equally for the same work. It can also prevent negative publicity around pay equity concerns. And obviously there are laws that you want to make sure you comply with respect to pay equity. So recently we've seen enforcement in pay equity become a focus of a lot of governmental agencies, as well as high profile litigation. For example, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, has made advancing equal pay one of its 6 major subject matter priorities in its proposed strategic enforcement plan for its 2023 through 2027. You might have also seen some high profile pay equity cases in the news. So for example, Google settled a pay equity class action last year for $118 million. Another example that has been in the news, U.S. women's soccer team filed charges with the EEOC as well as a federal action in California alleging gender discrimination. Eventually, this resulted in a settlement where the U.S. Soccer agreed to pay the women $24 million in back pay. And there has been pledges to equalize payments going forward. And finally, and most recently, last month, Attorneys General New York and California opened investigations into allegations of workplace discrimination and pay inequality at the NFL. So we obviously know that these sorts of issues give rise to litigation and governmental investigations. So that is all based upon a legal framework, both federal and promulgated by the state. So there pay discrimination is covered by the major federal anti-discrimination statutes like Title VII, as well as the Equal Pay Act. So the Equal Pay Act is focused solely on pay discrimination based on sex. It does not cover any other protected classes. In order to show a violation under the Equal Pay Act, an employee must show that they were paid lower wages to members of the opposite sex in the same workplace. The employees also must prove that they perform substantially equal work and that the jobs were performed under similar working conditions. The employee, importantly, does not have to show that the employer had an intent to discriminate. An employer can, however, avoid liability by demonstrating one of four justifications for pay disparities. If they have a seniority system, a merit system, a system which measures earnings or quality or quantity of production, or a differential based on any other factor other than sex. This means an employer must show that it had a legitimate business reason for implementing the gender neutral factor that brought about a wage differential. If that can be established, the burden then shifts back to the employee, who has to show that the employer's reasons for the pay differential were pretext for discrimination. Importantly, these types of federal class action claims or federal claims can give rise to class actions. As a remedy, if an employer is found liable under this act, the employee is entitled to 2 times the amount of unpaid wages and reasonable attorney's fees and costs. If a person has repeatedly or willfully violates the act, then that person or employer is subject to civil penalties not to exceed $1,100 for each violation. That might not sound like a whole lot, but that can add up when you take into account each and every violation. So states will often have their own pay equity laws that supplement the federal statute. For example, New York's Pay Equity Act applies very similar standards, but applies them to a broader category of protected classes: age, race, creed, color, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, domestic violence victim status, marital status, disability. So these are all the protected classes that you cannot engage in pay discrimination with regards to them. So this, as I indicated, the standard for the New York Equal Pay Act is the same standard to prove a prima facie case under the federal law, except it applies to those other protected classes in addition to sex. So the employer cannot pay different wages to employees in a protected class if the employees perform equal work on jobs requiring equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and the jobs are performed under similar working conditions. The same types of exceptions, though, as in the federal standard, also apply to the New York standard. So you can have the seniority system, the merit system, a system that measures the quantity or quality of production. Or you can have a bona fide factor other than status within a protected class, such as education, training, or experience that impacts the pay discrepancy. Regardless of whether an employer can show the pay differential is based on a legitimate business necessity, the employer can still be liable if the employer used a particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on the basis of a status within a protected class or classes, that an alternative employment practice exists that would serve the same purpose and does not provide for a differential, and the employer refused to use that alternative practice. So again, the remedies under these laws are very similar to those in the federal law. You can, a successful employee can obtain 2 times the total amount of unpaid wages or 3 times for a willful violation, plus attorney's fees, prejudgment interest, and cost. New York City also has a pay equity discrimination statute of its own. The government in that, it requires the government to collect pay equity data for government workers and prohibits unlawful discriminatory practices that cause a disparate impact. So one of the best ways to combat these types of pay equity issues before litigation is by conducting a pay equity audit. This type of audit helps a company determine differences in how comparable employees are paid. Pay equity audit generally identifies pay disparities among employees for performing equal or substantially similar work. It allows the employer to determine if there are lawful reasons for the pay disparities, and if there are not lawful reasons, it helps them remedy those unlawful pay disparities. These types of audits are generally conducted by counsel so that they are covered under the attorney-client privilege. And they are also a really good way for employers to be proactive in addressing these concerns. So there are 6 different steps when you are going through a pay equity audit. First, the employer has to gather all the relevant data regarding compensation differences. There are a variety of different aspects of the data to collect: demographics, experience, job description, so on and so forth. Most of this data is available through HR. Then the company will identify who the comparable employees are. There's not really a set way to do this, but in our experience, we kind of group together the similar employees based upon job family, job function, business division. It's important to note that job titles, while they're helpful, they are not the be all end all. So you want to make sure that you are looking to what the employees actually do, their job duties and responsibilities, rather than simply focusing on the title or job description. Companies should also look at where employees are located, physical surroundings, hazards they might encounter at work, and when they work. Finally, or the third step is you then take all that data and you have that data analyzed. Usually this is done by experts who will look at the different causes of pay, and they will essentially isolate the various factors so that they can focus in on the any impact that a protected class or membership in a protected class would have on the employee's pay. After taking into account all of the other factors, the analysis can then identify whether differences in pay are actually due to belonging in a protected class versus simply other factors, experience, responsibility, performance. Once that analysis is conducted, if there are pay discrepancies based on protected class that are identified, the company should then assess why there are pay discrepancies and if there are any justifications under the law. So if there's a bona fide factor that justifies the discrepancy, so increased education, training, or experience. If, on the other hand, there is not a identifiable legitimate business reason or bona fide factor, employers should remediate these discrepancies in a timely manner. So they can do that a few ways. You can adjust pay upward. You can modify salary, grade, or band of an employee. Or you can, for the employers with higher salaries, make those employees ineligible for further increases as long as they are in the same role and holding the same responsibilities. Importantly, a company cannot reduce an employee's pay to correct the pay disparity. Instead, the pay of the lower employee or the lower paid employee must be increased. These remedies should also be communicated, and the company should emphasize that the actions to promote that these actions are to promote fairness and pay equity. Finally, employers should follow up and continue to monitor these groupings to ensure that equity is maintained after the audit. So given the prominence of pay equity issues in the workplace and the positive outcomes that result from addressing these, we generally recommend that employers take a few steps to address the issues proactively. So we recommend that these annual audits are conducted, or that these audits be conducted on an annual basis. This is critical to preventing pay equity issues before they arise in a litigation or state agency investigation. Additionally, employers should routinely document reasons for any differences in pay among employees. This helps in the event that this becomes an issue down the road. So if there's a complaint or a lawsuit is filed, or when an audit is done, the employer will have that information readily available and therefore won't have to go back and piece together why a decision regarding compensation was made. We also recommend reviewing policies regarding compensation and ensuring compliance with those policies, including updating job descriptions, ensuring objectivity in setting pay, standardizing pay raises or pay ranges. This, along with training HR and other decision makers, helps preventing pay equity before it happens by ensuring consistently. And finally, we recommend communicating the company's commitment to pay equity in the workplace.
Thanks so much, Jen. Yeah, so really pay equity and the auditing process is your best proactive tool to realize if you have any unknown pay disparities underneath the hood, even if they're unintentional in your business. So that's the best way to really get ahead of it and have pay equity as well as pay transparency. I know we went a little bit over. I apologize for that, but thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Gershon. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you all for attending. Super interesting. We have a quick little poll here if anyone wants to get in touch with any of the speakers. And thank you, Ryan, Jennifer. Very, very interesting. I have one question, but no one has to stay to hear the answer. I'm curious about not cutting people's pay. So say, you got people who you pay $15 an hour, people who you pay $25 an hour, and your business only supports paying an average of $20 an hour. So we hire the attorneys come and they say, well, you got to raise this person 25. Well, my business, I can't pay $25 an hour. That's not how it works. So like we can't legislate economics. And if there is a significant disparity, who says that the business can raise that? And why can't you? I mean, I agree. It's not like great for optics if you start cutting salaries, but like if the government comes in or the attorneys come in and it is deemed that these people are equal, they're doing the same work and they must be paid the same thing, and we can't afford to pay the lower, the higher salary to everyone. One, what are we supposed to do? And two, why can't you just cut people? Like, why is that not also an expression of equity?
Right. So,
and everyone's welcome to leave. We're going to wind down after this question, but I'm curious and we're still here, so.
Right, so the idea is that the individual has been paid less than what they should have been paid. So you are essentially, you are remedying essentially the lower pay as opposed to remedying, so by lowering the pay, you're not actually fixing that problem. The idea is that they should have been paid more to begin with. And so you would still actually technically could potentially be liable if you didn't have a reasonable justification for that back pay as well.
But if the evidence that we're paying the lower person too little is that the higher person is getting paid more, then, I mean, maybe it's true. Maybe, I think you have to look at the bigger picture, right? We're not necessarily just talking about 2 employees. You could be talking about a whole department. This department costs X. Who says that these people are being underpaid as opposed to those people are being overpaid? Like what, how do we know that? And also, how do we know that? How do we?
Gershon, I think I think the way you're posing the question is an economics issue, but they're
agree.
not dealing with the economics of running your business. They're dealing with what the law says about an individual that fits into a class, and they're being compensated differently than other people around them in the same city. So here's maybe a different way to look at this, though, is what size business, because this will help with the economics you're asking, will also help with what they're selling us. I may have missed it in the beginning part of the meeting, but what size business do these laws apply to? How many employees do you have to have? How does it work?
In some places, 4 people.
Yeah,
So
that's in New York City.
So these laws do not have those types of limitations. So it's like, because the Federal Equal Pay Act, for example, is actually an amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So it actually, because of that, it actually applies to everyone. And then Ryan, you can double check me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe there's a limitation with respect to the New York Equal Pay Act either.
No.
So
It's just
Jennifer,
it's unlawful discrimination.
okay, so to Gershon's point, if you're a mom and pop business that you have less than 10 employees and you don't have more than 1 or 2, maybe you got 3 or 4 people that are construction workers and they're all being paid fine because they're all making the right amount of money. But you've got a person that's your office manager and you got someone doing your accounting and you got somebody doing business development. Their jobs are so different that they're not going to be complaining with each other that they're not equally compensated correctly. But what if an employee is disgruntled or unhappy about something, and maybe they're unhappy because they're not being paid correctly, and they're comparing their salary to their friend's salary that work at a bunch of different companies, to Gershon's point, and the guy that runs this business, it's a white guy, me, I'm the white guy running this business, and I'm paying you $40,000 a year to be my accountant, and so, but the job in New York City really pays 50. What stops that person from just leaving and going to that company that pays more money? So why wouldn't people be going to I think that's part of what Gershon is maybe not asking, but that's what's implied. I mean, a person can always leave and go somewhere else. So are we only talking about people within their company that are not being paid the same? So you have to have a sizable organization in order to get audited, and you have to, because the government's not going to audit a company that isn't going to produce. They want to catch the people that are cheating, and they're going to have to go after a company that's a certain size. Statistically, they're not going to have any benefit going on after a company with only 10 or 15 employees. They're not going to find anything. And those size companies don't have HR departments, because I love the 6 steps that go into the process of how you need to prepare for an audit. That's also telling you how you run a business, because that's what you should do. But you can only do that if you can afford to do it. And I think what Gershon's question had a lot to do with was some companies are small and they just can't afford to do or they don't even think this way. They just don't. I mean, when we go into a lot of companies, we're finding that the way they're thinking about running different aspects of their business isn't sustainable for them. And that's what we discover. And we try to convince them, hey, if you go spend money in this, you're going to be able to generate this much more business. Or if you spend money on this, you're going to save this much. You're going to minimize your risk. But they're not always thinking that way. And I think this is what you've laid out here in my mind is a way to think about transparency and equity, which I think is awesome. But that is not, I would argue that this is not, it's not the way a lot of people think, and it certainly isn't how they think about getting up and running their business every day, because they're trying to survive in a down economy with inflation and everything else. They're just trying to get through the day. And this is the last thing they want to think about. But this may not necessarily apply so much to that size company. This is more for, let's say, a $10 million business and above that's got 50 employees, and they are doing some things that they won't be able to survive an audit. And if they're making $10 million and the government wants to come in and look at them because they have 50 employees, they might, let me ask it a different way. Is there a sweet spot for the size companies that are being looked at for these types of audits?
So let me just clarify. So these audits are actually, we recommend that these are not audits that the government is coming in and necessarily doing, although they can. These are our recommendations to resolve these types of pay equity issues on a proactive basis. Because, you know, if you have complaints of employees or lawsuits that, you know, are brought based upon pay inequity. Now, from a practical standpoint, if you're dealing, you do have to be dealing with, you know, a larger pool when you're dealing with these sorts of pay equity analyses, because you have to be looking at two or more employees who have the same job, the same, you know, at the same work, in the same work environment, with the same skills, same duties, same experience. All those sorts of things have to be identical, and then there's still that disparity. So remember, we have to isolate out all of that other information so that we can just look at the, you know, protected class. So from a practical standpoint, yeah, you probably aren't going to see this come about with those smaller companies. But I mean, that doesn't mean that people can't bring claims or report to, you know, the Department of Labor or the New York City Human Rights Commission,
Right.
you know, those are still available avenues. And, you know, disgruntled employees, unfortunately, sometimes they, you know, bring those claims regardless of if they're valid or not. You know, they might file lawsuits or they might file these charges, and that's still something that you have to respond to. And so if you can take these proactive steps and keep track of why the compensation decisions are made the way they're made, it will make combating that in the future a whole lot easier, because you don't have to kind of, you know, go back and rethink, well, why did we make this decision back then?
In other words, you'd have your playbook ready to go before somebody shows up on your doorstep saying what's going on.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, when you have a workplace that everyone knows is, you know, equitable, where you don't have somebody who's saying, you know, I think John over there he's doing the same exact thing as me, but I think I'm getting paid less than him. You know, people tend to be happier and feel more value from their employer. And ultimately that increases productivity and that increases retention. So these are all, at the end of the day, by taking these proactive steps, not only are you limiting your liability, but it's also can be good for business.
One of the things that was interesting when I worked at companies like Timberland and Coach was Timberland and more Coach in New York City, because they were big. We were big. We had thousands of employees. They had a policy in HR that said you could not come to HR and compare your compensation to somebody else's, because they could not discuss what somebody else was making. But and obviously there's a reason why that is, but there's also a reality of they didn't want to have that conversation. But when people came to me and working for me, if they said, well, and the people talked at lunch and at the water cooler, and everybody knew what everybody else was making, even though you're not supposed to talk about it. But they do. And I think it's even more prevalent today. Is the closer we get to transparency, the more people are sharing information. And I think millennials care less about people knowing how much they earn than, let's say, baby boomers did. And that's just my anecdotal perspective. It's not necessarily analytical. But if we're moving in a direction where people share more information and there's more information out there and everything's cameras, like when we started this whole conversation, that's what you guys were talking about. I think the reality of not knowing what everybody else has going on actually bolsters the ability to keep things equitable, keep it fair. But at the same time, when people would come to me complaining about how much they were earning, it was easy for me to have a conversation about why they were earning what they were earning. And in order for them to get to that next level of earning, what they needed to do to get there, because we always had, or I always created, really good job descriptions. So when a person said, well, I do the same job as so-and-so, I'd say, well, I can't talk to you about what they're making, but I can show you their job description versus yours. And let's talk about the differences. And I think people don't always understand the differences between the different jobs and the companies. And if a company doesn't, one of the biggest issues and struggles that I have with my clients today is that almost none of them that I've worked with so far, working with Gershon or prior to Gershon as a consultant, had good job descriptions. They just don't. And the ones that don't have them struggle the most to sustain their businesses and keep them going. I'm a huge advocate for job descriptions. And with the job description, you can get into a lot of what you guys are talking about, which is create a range. What's the value of it? Check it in the marketplace because you wrote a job description. You can put it online and it really defines what the job is. I think if people and companies did a better job of focusing on job descriptions and creating good positions for their people, there'd be a lot less of this type of these types of shenanigans going on in the workplace with disparities, because it would eliminate the ability to have the disparity. You'd almost have to do it on purpose, as opposed to employers and owners falling into a trap because they're just not paying enough attention. And then it would make it easy to do the 6 steps that you're talking about. So for example, when you showed that slide, gathering that data is a lot of work.
It is quite an undertaking. Hopefully you have, an HR that has it all in, relatively electronically in one place. Unfortunately not everybody has the ability to have that. But in an ideal world, you'd be able to do those audits on an annual basis, look at all these, but sometimes you just have to focus on a certain job description or a certain group of people. There are ways to limit the scope of what you're doing with respect to the audit, so it's a little bit more feasible if there might be an issue with this area, or this individual is complaining about, this type of discrepancy. So there are ways to make it a little bit more palatable and a little less broad.
Do you think payroll companies like ADP and even smaller ones like Gusto and stuff like that are doing a good job in keeping track of information in a way that it can then become more easily so everybody, that you can manage it in the way that you guys just described? That it's transparent, for example, that it can become transparent to the employer, because that would be helpful, because a lot of the companies that we're dealing with are using payroll companies.
Excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
I gotta hop. I'm gonna leave, but it should stay open.
Okay.
Thanks, Gershon. Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you all. Sorry for interrupting. I have a call coming up in a couple minutes.
So my question, Jennifer, is will payroll companies be able to help an employer keep track of stuff like this? Because most of the clients that I deal with are using payroll companies and they don't have an HR organization.
Right. So I do think, at least for a lot of the data, the payroll companies should be able to have it in, one relative area, to the extent that they keep track of demographics, of pay, obviously they keep track of pay. But then you also are going to have job descriptions, performance evaluations. So
Exactly,
those need
yeah.
to be, education, resumes, licenses, certifications, those sorts of things. So there is a lot of the data can probably come from that, but some of it is more, is going to have to come from the actual organization.
Yeah, I had a client last year that he claimed that they did performance reviews on an annual basis based on the employee's anniversary date of joining the company. And that sounds good, right? But it's conventional wisdom. First of all, who's keeping track that everybody's getting there? And then the performance review that they got wasn't tied to their annual increase, which happened at Christmas time for everybody. I just found that, I'll be blunt, it's ludicrous. You need a more formal process. Let's go through the process for everybody all at the same time, and let's decide what is associated with those performance reviews, whether it's going to be an increase or bonus or whatever, and make it seamless, and it's done as a part. The whole company goes through it at the same time. You're going to get way more bang for the buck because you're going to have a lot less effort that goes into it because it's not sporadic. And then as you continue to hire people into your company, what if you end up with a lot of people that joined in a particular month because your business happened to be growing, and now you've got more requirement to do more all at once in a month, but everything's spread out, as opposed to the HR organization and the accounting organization and the leaders of the company all know in these 8 weeks of the month of the year, we have to set aside time for this activity. Then you set aside it as a chunk, and it's all related to each other. And I think there's a lot to be said for businesses that think and work the way I'm describing, but I'm OCD, I'm an accountant, I'm super analytical. And I like to grab data, gather data, and then analyze it to figure out what can I do about what is the data telling me. But that's why people hire me, right? So at the end of the day, if you have an entrepreneur who's running a business, they don't want to do, they might even hate what I just described. They know they have to do it, but they don't want to do it because they're the creative mind, right? They're the one out there creating their business future. So you've got smaller businesses that have this creative aspect, and they have to survive in the economy that we're in. And how do they do that? It's just COVID, supply chain issues, stuff that our government and we've brought upon ourselves, all of these things that happen in our economy, and now we're trying to find our way out of it. So you have to be ingenious. And this is more administrative. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So the resources in these companies that we're working with are generally not the administrative resources that they require, and trying to convince them to hire even one administrative resource is a level of effort on our part. But this gives the transparency to me is super important. But then you start looking at it on a global basis, and that changes everything. Because, I mean, I've worked in countries other than the United States, and the way companies try to deal with that, like Timberland is a really good company. The way we tried to deal with an expat going to the Dominican Republic and working there, and the amount of money that person was making as an expat because they gave them extra money because they were moving to what I call the tropical paradise. After I was there for a year and a half, I told the corporation, we have too many expats, we're overpaying them. They don't have to pay taxes anyway because you're in a different country, and you have the government has a cap on how much you can make before you even start paying taxes when you're outside the US. If you're, and it was a big number, it's like 75,000 plus benefits get you up to $1.25. And this was in the 1990s. So it's a lot higher than that now. So why would a company pay somebody extra to go to a tropical paradise? What and then you had to have the expat getting this massive amount of money and a Dominican local that's making a fraction of that. And I'm trying to increase what I'm paying the Dominicans. And I said, there's Dominicans here that can do a better job than these expats that we're hiring, and we don't need them. They wanted to take me out back and tar and feather me. But when we started to really think about what I was saying, we started to reduce the number of expats in certain areas of the business, and we were looking to hire locally. We drove our costs down, and we got better performance. People just don't want to admit it. but transparency is huge in any aspect of a business. So I commend you guys for what you're trying to bring to the forefront of what I think is important to our country, because it's a global economy now. Look at what's going on. I mean, I was talking to a company the other day. They farmed out some aspect of their work to the Philippines. The Philippines, they speak excellent English, so you can understand exactly what they're saying. They'll work on your same time zone, but they're being paid a fraction of what we pay in the United States for what we consider the same job. But then I said to the employer, but you've only got 3 or 4 people in the Philippines, and you've got people in Florida, and you've got people in New Jersey, and you've got people in New York, and in New York, you got them in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. You have too many offices. How do you guys communicate effectively in this remote environment? I said, I can't see that bowl of spaghetti working. So did you really lower your costs, or did you save money in a particular position, but you're spending it somewhere else because you're spending twice or 3 times as much time? And how much of your time has to be invested as the boss that's making the big money? But I think all of that plays into some of this too, because is it fair that the people in the Philippines or Vietnam are making 1/10, or somebody in a Chinese manufacturing plant is making $2 or $3 an hour? And that might even include the overhead, of $4 an hour with overhead. But in the United States, that same job would have to pay $20 an hour. But again, this goes all the way back to the conversation about poverty, because in the 1960s and 70s, when special interest groups were all that was lobbying Congress, and that shifted to businesses lobbying Congress greatly. It spiked in the 1970s. And what they were doing was pushing down the minimum wage in this country till we woke up how many years ago, not too long ago, that people were making less than $10 an hour, but we're basically keeping them impoverished. That's, to me, what a huge issue is. So you look at Walmart. Walmart did a great job of wiping out mom and pops who paid living wages to the people who work for them in their towns. They created jobs that paid they paid minimum wage, but that minimum wage basically kept people impoverished. Those people were on food stamps. And where are they spending their money? In Walmart. And you can see Secretary of Labor Paulson talks a lot about this. He was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor. I think his last name was Paulson. He does TED Talks now. Mm-hmm. This stuff is fascinating to me, because I think it's got us into the cycle that we have in this country today. And I think what you're highlighting is one of the things that has become a reality. The thing I'm talking about is inequity in pay. But to me, it's much deeper than women versus men, white versus black, or people of color. I think it's much deeper than that. And I think that as we peel back the onion and we create the transparency, and then all of a sudden women are making the same amount as men, we're going to finally get to a place where there's these low-paying jobs in this country that are just so low-paying that we've created poverty, and we need to change that. And when we change that for 60 million Americans, then all of a sudden we don't have to spend all of this other money in all these other areas that's costing us $1 trillion to deal with poverty. And that's how you wipe poverty out, is you pay people what they're worth to get the job done. And then how does it work on a global scale? To me, I can't put my mind around that one yet. That one's too big for me to figure out. Do you see the logic? Do you see what I'm saying here of how complex this whole concept is?
It is, but we're on a step towards the right direction. And I really think there will be a federal law in place soon, filling in all the gaps so that pay transparency will be nationally based. So,
but what happens when pay transparency becomes national for the United States, which then causes employers to go overseas and hire people that they don't have to put up with all of these rules that we're creating, because it's a global economy and everything's being done remotely. So to me, just like we pushed manufacturing offshore, we could be pushing jobs offshore. That's, and I'm not saying that transparency isn't right. I think it is, but we're dealing with global. And I think this is kind of what Gershon was getting at. What happens when you're the company that can't afford what everybody else is paying? Because that's what I heard. That's what I thought I heard Gershon saying. You mean I gotta go out of, well, you might have to go out of business, pal. I mean, that's the way it is. You can't underpay, but how would you even be able to employ people in a market like New York City if you were underpaying for the same job? You're running a deli in the morning and you got a fry cook and you're paying him half of what you're paying somebody else. Why would they work for you? Why would they even do that? Well, maybe they don't have another option because, well, now we may be illegal immigrants or something. I don't know. But if that's not the case, why would I work for you paying me less money than I can work for why would I work for you, Ryan, to pay me less money than Jennifer would pay me for effectively the same job? There's got to be some other attraction.
Mhm.
That
Point of it, right? It's the point of the pay transparency, to arm people with the
Exactly.
knowledge they could make those decisions. So there's a lot on the books now. It's going to get interesting. If anybody wants to sign up for our e-alerts that our firm sends out routinely on updates on these laws, you could send Jennifer or myself an email and you'll receive those updates, but we'll stay on top of this. We greatly appreciate everybody's time. If you have any questions, you can follow up by email as well.